Scott's going to be so sad he missed out today.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, good people, and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. It is time for your Friday afternoon podcast recording. I'm joined by Bailey Perkins. Hello, Bailey.
Hello, Andy. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Scott is at work. He is not with us today. Condolences to him, and we will miss his restrained anger at the current state of affairs in our fair state. And actually, today, Bailey, I think we're going to start with talking about not just that it's deadline week, or that it was deadline week. Yesterday, Thursday, the 25th, was the first major milestone for the state legislature. It was the deadline by which bills had to be out of committee in the Chamber of Origin. And so we'll talk about a few of those later on in the show. But first, let's actually go up to the federal level. I don't have a good federal sound effect, but we'll come up with one for future podcasts. and then we'll talk about, well, let's start with COVID relief. We haven't talked about COVID in several weeks. Things are looking up. Numbers of cases are going down. Deaths are going down. Vaccinations are going up around the state and around the country. But before we got going, we were talking about the American Rescue Plan. Bailey, what do you know about it?
Yes, so the American Rescue Plan is President Biden's ideas of and priorities of how Congress plus the executive branch can come together to get COVID relief to families, to businesses, to those who have been harmed and impacted in a lot of different ways. We are still in a pandemic, as well as an economic downturn. And so this is the Biden administration's promise to do things like the stimulus payments to families, to boost the child care tax credit, bolstering the EITC, putting more funds to restore and expand the Paycheck Protection Program for businesses and small business relief, working on unemployment assistance and bolstering that, eviction relief. So there's a number of things that this bill would do to help more than 40 million, not 40 million, like millions and millions of Americans across the country, in addition to continued support around vaccine distributions and ensuring that states have the resources that they need to continue combating coronavirus as we see light at the end of the tunnel. And right. So the process that they're trying to use is called the budget reconciliation process to basically update what was passed in 2020 before this new administration came into place. So it's a complicated process of what budget reconciliation means, but it gives them the ability to increase funding on a number of services and programs and do it within this fiscal year.
Right. And yesterday, day before, the Senate parliamentarian had ruled for their chamber that they could not include the $15 an hour increase in minimum wage, or the increase to $15 an hour. And last I saw, the House was planning to include that in theirs when they passed it, knowing that it might be stripped out in the Senate. And we should have a whole other episode about the filibuster, because I feel like everyone's talking about it, and I continually learn new things. In fact, last night, Scott sent me a tweet that he saw with someone named Jessica Ellis. Says, every time I think I'm an educated adult who understands how Congress works, they're like, oh dear, the Wiki Walker has declared a no Tuesday vote. We must adjourn till next week. And then, I would never overrule the Wiki Walker, Senator Manchin told reporters, crab walking sideways from the chamber as is prescribed by no Tuesdays. And I was like, man, that's that's the truth, right? Like there's a bunch of stuff about it that I don't get, and some of the procedures for Congress, which are just rules that they've adopted at some point, and particularly in the Senate, they don't like to change their rules because they feel they're high and mighty. And so, yeah, let's have an episode about the filibuster here in a few weeks.
Absolutely. And even in the thought about constantly learning about process, that's one of the reasons about Congress not having term limits, right? The only way that you really understand the systems and the strategies on what can or can't be done and the interpretations on procedure come from knowing it and knowing what happened 20 years ago and different things. And so we have lawmakers who have been around the block and have seen different iterations to be able to know different areas of parliamentary procedure. So I think that's an interesting facet on, the conversation constantly, comes up of whether Congress should have term limits, but one of the downsides to that is it takes a long time to learn all the ins and outs of process. And it's definitely not going to happen within 6 years, probably not even 12.
Right. Exactly right. Well, and the same thing happens at the state level where we do have term limits. A few years ago, there was a lot of scuttlebutt that members of the House were disenfranchised with, or members of the House were not big fans of Speaker McCall at the time. And there was all these rumors that they were going to try to unseat him or something during the session. And apparently there's a parliamentary way to do it, but they said no one who's in office now knows how to do it. The last time it was done, was before anyone else was here, and it involved, switching off someone's microphone so you could make a certain motion to table blah 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 blah, and of course it didn't happen. I also suspect on some level that people just like the idea that this kind of thing is possible, and all these rumors about some kind of like a secret rule, like a cheat code for how to do parliamentary procedure. So,
and don't let anyone tell you, listeners, that it's about a partisan thing or one party is, abusing their power. Anyone who's in the majority tries to strategize and navigate how they can make the things that they want to see happen. So all the things that we're seeing and reading about and discussing in these different changes in procedure to get policy through the process is dependent upon who's in the driver's seat.
right. And, it seems to me that the same people who were apparently epidemiological experts for a long time, and then elections experts, and then meteorological experts are now also constitutional law and filibuster experts on social media. It's the same people. They are just so broad based knowledge. It's really pretty exceptional. All right, well, let's move on and talk about another piece of federal legislation that I expect will come into the full news cycle this next week. And listeners, we've mentioned this before. It's called the For the People Act. There's a bill in the House and in the Senate. This is in Congress in D.C. It's H.R. 1 in the House and it's S1 in the Senate. And this bill would have some pretty far reaching, not implications, but changes to elections law. It would eliminate gerrymandering, at least for congressional seats. It would mandate automatic voter registration and online voter registration, civic education, helping teenagers register to vote, pre-register to vote. And it's running kind of hand in hand with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And together, both those pieces of legislation would actually restore a significant portion, if not all, of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that has basically been rolled back or eliminated since that time. That was one of the sweeping pieces of legislation that was passed in the 60s to, to expand civil rights and to try to make the law, I won't say fair, we'll say more fair, right? Or at least more friendly to minorities and specifically Black communities. And the fact that it has been systematically damaged, right? Or like pieces removed is a I don't know, a testament to the travesty of American government for the last 50 years, I guess. And so these would have really big consequences. One of the things I think is most interesting, this connects to the filibuster, right, is that there have been a lot of smart people, Ezra Klein and others, if you guys follow them on the social medias, who have said, at some point, it looks like Congress is going, or that the Senate is going to have to deal with the filibuster. And the decision isn't whether to nuke the filibuster, that is, do away with it or not. It's for what issue do you decide to do away with it? And the one that people keep going back to, and I think it's a good move, is like if you're gonna go to extreme measures, you do it for stuff that fixes the system for all voters, right? And the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act are those kinds of changes. This is the big, hairy, systems level, small d democratic changes that we need.
Well, and I'd add too the timing of it is significant because we're seeing a lot of blowback and consequences at the state level from this past election cycle, from the narrative that there was cheating in the election, that the election was rigged, and all of these other narratives that float. And so we're seeing things like narrowing and limiting opportunities for early voting and narrowing timelines of who can get absentee ballots in different states. And so all of these restrictions on the voting process make the timing of the For the People Act coming back into this cycle urgent. And so, because Andy and I were just talking about before the podcast started that Congress is going to tackle, well, as we speak, they're tackling a COVID relief bill. And then next week, they're going to try to get to For the People. And then the following week, they're going to try to do John Lewis For the People. I mean, the John Lewis legislation for the Voting Rights Act to ensure that those cornerstones are taken care of to ensure that the American people aren't disenfranchised. Because when we talk about civil rights and we talk about civil liberties, they have to constantly be fought for. And if we're not careful and we're not keeping a close eye and using our voices to ensure that things don't sneak up after people don't like election results, then that can hurt our country. And so we have to continue speaking out. And I think the timing of Congress taking this up and hopefully getting it through the process is necessary.
Yeah. So one of the things that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act does is it like restores some of the things that have been removed, as we said. And the the way things have happened is that since 1965, legislation and specifically like states have either enacted or begun to practice discriminatory behaviors regarding voting rights. Everything from voting ID laws to how they move polling places or how the polling hours, everything around how elections are conducted. And all of that stuff gets litigated, right? It gets taken to court, usually like the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center, or someone is involved in it when it gets to a high enough level. And they have to litigate that in the courts, which is time consuming and expensive, right? And if you're a state who is passing laws or enacting policies that disenfranchise people that have less resources, right? Especially money and access to those resources and connections, then it's harder for them to fight against it. And so what this would do is like right size some of that stuff, put those protections back in place up front so they don't have to be litigated against, because we have all these cases that they've won to like fix the things that have happened, but we're having to do it case by case. And this would basically codify those rulings into law and saying up front, like, you just can't do these things. The courts have been saying for decades you can't do these things one by one. We're saying it now from Congress. Stop doing it. It's illegal.
And Andy, that would also clear up, what is or isn't possible, because if election results have to be overturned or something changes in result of litigation or different practices, that contributes to the narrative of it's unfair, the system's broken, there's fraud and cheating in the system, right? Anytime there's any changes or shifts in processes within the election. And so I think over time that creates that standard of equity as well, to help ensure that we can rebuild trust in America's election systems.
Right, which is a particularly big deal in places like Oklahoma, where we have very low voter turnout. And when you ask people, a lot of folks that are registered that don't turn out to vote is because they feel like their vote doesn't matter because they feel like the system's already gamed against them, right? Or it's unduly difficult for them to vote. And this goes right to that, right? All right. Well, so we're very excited. We'll pay attention to that over the next couple of weeks, listeners, and update you as it progresses. If you have feelings about it, I strongly encourage you to reach out to your member of Congress, even if you don't think that they may vote the way that you want them to. That doesn't mean you shouldn't ask, right? And failing to ask is a no. You might as well ask. The worst they can do is say no.
But also, you just don't want our elected leaders to have the ability to say that no one contacted me. I didn't know. And so we have to, one way of holding our elected leaders accountable is sharing where we stand on something and where we would like them to vote. So that way it can be on record that you did have constituents tell you that they wanted you to support XYZ or give you perspective on X issue.
That's right. Decisions are made by those who show up, and showing up includes phone calls and emails to your member of Congress or your statewide elected official.
Well, and Andy, speaking of disenfranchisement on voting, I think this would be also a good segue to talk about the state level, the bill that would allow appointments to congressional seats rather than calling for special election, because that's one way of getting around the will of the people in voting, in my opinion.
That's right. So you're referring to House Bill 2173 by Hilbert in the House, and Senator Taylor is the co-author, right? Or yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
They this is specifically dealing with what happens when Inhofe retires, right? I mean, I think it doesn't say that in the bill, but we all know that's what it's about, right? And so the bill, the current process is that if a U.S. senator retires or dies in office or whatever, is removed from office for some kind of malfeasance, then there would be a special election, just like there is for any of the state house or state senate seats. And that's the way it's been for a while. And this bill would allow the governor to appoint someone to fill that position. And I guess what happens is the Speaker of the House would give the governor 3 names, and the governor picks one of those people, right? So it's like not just up to him, as if they're not talking behind the scenes about like, oh, well, I want this person, and this, like, but it's a 2-person of conspiracy there at least.
Yeah, it puts it in law and creates the structure for those behind the scenes conversations to be actualized, right? It streamlines that process to go around the voters to make the will of what the majority wants to happen.
Right. As if their chosen person wouldn't win the election anyway. But I think this all gets to the reality, right? That likely Senator Inhofe ran for re-election last year because he didn't want to leave it as an open race where it's a Republican versus a Democrat. And the chances are the Republican, like there would be a chance Republicans run a terrible, like hyper conservative, for whatever reason, or a bad candidate, and the Democrats win. Like Inhofe doesn't want to take that chance.
Or it's a person that isn't going to further the agenda and the lens that he has set for the way that he governs, right? And
yeah.
So either way, it could be somebody who could win, but may not do the things that he thinks they should be doing. So
not his chosen, Padawan learner there, right? And so this would allow them to handpick his successor, right? And so, but this isn't the way it's always been, right? At some point, it was different. Like right now, the process is that we would have a special election. But you said you saw a tweet from Keith Gaddy.
Yeah, so Keith Gaddy made a Facebook post that mentioned back in the 60s, he said 63 in particular, there was a governor that appointed himself to fill a vacancy. And so that's why the people said, no, we're going to vote on this thing. And so now we're going back to a time that allows interest over the will of the people to
Right.
make the decision of who should fill a role. And my biggest concern, because when you look at political positions, oftentimes, not always, because this is changing, but oftentimes incumbents have an advantage in a political race because they're able to build the relationships and the contacts and do the fundraising and roles. And so even if this is the person fills the role for 2 years and then there's an election, that's 2 years of them being able to be the sitting senator, right? Or the sitting member of Congress or whatever the scenario is. And so that creates a place that whoever's sitting there can potentially be the person who's elected over time to maintain that role in, more than 2 decades, in the way that, our sitting senator has been serving since 1994, right? And so I would hope that the Senate would have a different point of view and not allow that to move through the process, because it's still important for the people to weigh in to decide who that person is that should represent our state, because that senator represents all 4 million of us, and we all should be able to at least have a say in who we want to fill a vacancy or to be able to serve us, and not political interests.
Yeah, I can't imagine this would go over well with a lot of the public, even Republicans, right? Generally, when when politicians are like, you know what, I know you elect this position, but I would like to appoint the position instead. That doesn't go over well with Oklahomans.
A very populous state
Right.
historically.
No, we would elect the dog catcher, right? Is often the joke. Like we have a ton of elected positions because the public doesn't trust politicians to do the right thing or hire the right people or appoint the right people. And so, what's funny about this too, given that history that Keith Gaddy shared, is that it has long been rumored that Governor Stitt was wanted to appoint himself to Inhofe's seat, and I wonder if this clause where the speaker would give him three names. I mean, I assume he could give him his own name as one of those names, right? Like what if Speaker McCall was like, you can appoint you or me or Treat, like, pick one of the leaders. Um, I guess that's not illegal. Would it be popular? No. Is it a good political decision? Probably not. But it seems like it's still plausible. But you are right that it may not pass the Senate. And I've noticed that Senator Treat has been awfully quiet about these kinds of issues so far this session. Have you felt that too?
I have.
And another one that came up along those same lines, it's actually one of the speaker's bills, um, deals with what we would do with our leftover money, our theoretical leftover money this year, right? So,
Well, and to before we explain that, like, the Board of Equalization is the entity that looks at the tax receipts that the state has collected in from income tax collections and fees on different things, and different services that the state provides and receives revenue from, to give us a picture of what our legislature will have to work with as they build the budget for this fiscal year, because every year the legislature has to come together and decide a balanced budget. And so knowing what the budget projection is will tell them, do they have enough to allocate to agencies? Will they have to propose cuts? Or will they have enough to be able to put back in a rainy day fund? And so they rely on those estimates from the Board of Equalization to give them a framework of how much they may have to work with. And the Board of Equalization said that we have a pretty good picture this year in comparison to previous years, that there's more money that the state has collected than they originally expected. And so that gives the legislature the opportunity to do all kinds of things with the revenue, right?
Well, and so part of the reason we have this extra money is because we didn't appropriate all the money that we could have last year, because they knew last year was going to be shorter because the pandemic had just happened while they were meeting. And so they were like, okay, well, we probably shouldn't spend what we think we'll have to spend because we may not actually.
They're kind of forward think.
Yeah, right. A surprising plan of planning ahead for our state government. And indeed, that's the case. And so now they're like, well, now we got extra money. Well, we only have extra money because we didn't spend the full amount before. And we under budgeted, which is smart. Like we planned for less. So it's not really extra money. We could, for example, return funding to where it was, or we could invest that money in core services that have been either habitually underfunded for years and years and years, or that have had their budgets cut over that time, right?
Because having more revenue doesn't equate to having adequate budgets and adequate services for people, right?
Right. Right.
And so just because the revenue picture looks better than expected doesn't mean that need doesn't exist in the state.
No, and it's a interesting thing. So there are a couple of things that come out of this. One is the idea of a potential tax credit of, I think it's $1,400 for every family that has kids in school, like in K through 12 school. They would give them, but that money would come out of, not out of education funding, but out of the general revenue fund. So basically, you wouldn't get a check. It's not like a stimulus check. It would be a tax credit. So you'd file your state income taxes. And if you had a child in school, then you get the credit. But it's a one credit regardless of how many kids you have in school, which raises some questions for me. And I haven't read it yet, but like, I have two kids from a previous marriage, and me and their mom each claim one. And so it's like, well, do we both get the credit then? Because they're both in school, which would be beneficial to us, because if she claimed both kids, then she would only get 1,400. But if we can both claim it, we both get 1,400, and then I could give her some of that money to help offset the additional expenses. And so that's just like one of those little things where I was like, oh man, this may not be a well thought out plan by the state.
And it's an assumption that only those who have children are the ones who have needs. So it leaves out the taxpayers who may be struggling because of the pandemic. Maybe they had hours cut at their job and they may not have children, or maybe they have a dependent that's not a child that they're having to help take
Right.
care of. So they may have added expenses, but the state wouldn't be giving them relief as well. I think
Well,
the state could think about something like the earned income tax credit that already exists
mhm,
that would
right.
benefit a wider net of people and would be cheaper and faster tax relief that we know works and could also then help families. So I don't know why the legislature wants to recreate the wheel on that when we have other mechanisms that can help provide that tax relief.
I'm going to guess it's because many of them have children in school, but they do not qualify for the EITC, right? Like they're like, hey, I would benefit from this. And people I know, right? They could middle income, like, middle class, upper middle class families that have kids in school would get $1,400 in tax credit. But if you've got, if you are a say a single mom and you've got three kids that are all in school, right? Then you would get $1,400, and that is likely less than what your benefit from the earned income tax credit would be. So, yeah. Also, what if they use that money and gave teachers pay raises instead? Like if it's, there's all these other things that it's like, well, we're still not really competitive in the region for teacher pay. That was a huge deal 2 years ago. Ain't no one talking about it right now.
And teacher pay is only one facet of what the needs are in public education, right? Support staff are needed. There's more school counselors that are needed per child in each school district. School districts need support with facilities, because there's this huge push across the country to get kids back in school, but the schools have to pay for ways to ensure that there's enough teachers to do it safely, b, to figure out how to make sure that the schools can be sanitized and implement the protocols that are really going to keep teachers and students safe, right? And so those things cost money. And there isn't conversation about how schools are going to be supported to continue all of those things, especially because those COVID resources aren't going to be there forever. So, what are we going to do to ensure that schools can maintain their safety so that kids can go back to school 5 days a week?
Right. And also, this is one of those things where if they pass it now, it wouldn't go into effect until likely November 1st. I don't think there's an emergency clause on it. But even if it was, it wouldn't be effective in time for this year's taxes. So it would apply to your 2021 tax return that you will file next year in 2022, which means that will be revenue that the state does not collect next year, right? It's if you're getting tax money back, then it's money that I guess they collected now, but it would be additional money they won't have then. And who knows if we're going to need it then. And so this is one of those it's forward thinking, but not in a good way.
Well, and think about the election season incentive, right?
Oh,
So it's March, April, May, and people are getting these checks and refunds from tax season in fiscal year 22, and you're in primary season, and
I
then
did that
prepare
for
to
you.
go into, yeah. I mean, it's almost like the Donald Trump signing his name on the stimulus check kind of ideas, that the legislature can say, look what we did. We gave you money back in tax relief. So
Aren't we so generous? Yeah. Well, and related to that is Speaker McCall also has a bill that would basically phase out the corporate income tax over a 5-year period, reduce it to zero so that corporations would pay no income tax to the state. And potentially, he was like, and maybe if there's money left over, we will give the regular folks a tiny reduction in the personal income tax rate, which this goes back to when I first started Let's Fix This in 2016, because we had this stupid trigger bill or trigger mechanism in our state income tax rates, where if the economy grew, then the income tax rate would get cut, which makes sense if your economy is growing, you know, leaps and bounds. But we just had this back then, we'd had a financial crisis, the economy tanked, and then it got a little bit better. And they're like, oh, it's getting better. Let's cut the income tax rate. But we had dropped so much that it ended up shorting the state $1 billion, right? Here we are again, coming on the heels of a pandemic that is still, the consequences of which are still echoing through or rippling through our state economy.
and when COVID goes away, it's still going to take time for the economy to rebound.
Right, right. And the the way that things tend to affect Oklahoma, like we all know that, we're late to the party on everything. We get cool stuff 2 years late or 5 years late. We get bad stuff 2 to 5 years late too, right? And so it'll hit New York or California or Texas, and then eventually it'll ripple on down here. And so we may not feel the full effects of this economically for a couple of years. And so if we, I don't know, cut off, $100 billion a year or $300 billion a year, excuse me, 100 million or $300 million a year in corporate income tax, then that benefits some corporations, doesn't necessarily benefit most Oklahomans, and in fact hurts us because we've got less money then to do the same amount of stuff, right?
Or to put in a rainy day fund to restore, right? Because we talked in the last episode
Yeah.
about how we use some of those funds for a time when we were in a rainy day, right? And then we have Medicaid expansion that we passed that we have to fund over time, because for a while we'll have that 90% that the federal government will give to us, but that won't last forever. So we can be forward thinking about that versus making permanent cuts to revenue sources.
The idea that like, Devin should pay less in corporate income taxes because because the speaker wants that to happen, right? He said it's to be competitive with Texas, which doesn't have a corporate income tax. Well, Texas doesn't have a personal income tax either. And so Governor Stitt's statement was like, well, we need more taxpayers, not taxes. It's like, yes, Texas has like tens of millions of people more than Oklahoma. It is a much larger state with a lot more people, so they have more taxpayers. And if your goal is to get more taxpayers, not more taxes, like eliminating the corporate income tax rate isn't bringing people to Oklahoma.
I've never heard anyone say the reason why our company moved to X state or Y area was because they didn't have a corporate income tax. Never
Right.
heard that. And I mean, if the idea is to have more taxpayers, not taxes, how can there be more corporate taxpayers if there isn't a mechanism for them to pay their
Right.
share, right?
Right.
So
Right.
we never see those dollars trickle down to the people as much as that conversation is constantly had that if we just get all these businesses to come to our state, then those monies will trickle down to everyone else. And that never happens, right? And so I don't think that cutting a revenue source is going to be the silver bullet that rushes businesses to Oklahoma's areas of need.
Right.
It's not.
Our state's economic planning leaves something to be desired, at least for me. And it sounds like for you and probably lots of other Oklahomans. Call your state legislators too. While you're calling your Congress people about the For the People Act, call your state House rep and state senator about these budget bills. As we get into further down the road in the spring, I think these things will come up and be front and center. Oh, but also, we've not heard anything from Treat about this. I heard from the governor and the speaker, but I didn't see any comment from Senator Treat. So it may be that these bills are a bit of a platform for Speaker McCall.
Definitely,
Well,
yeah.
anywhere,
They definitely could be just, political ideas of lifting what things they would want to see over time versus what's going to actually happen.
yeah,
That's the great thing about the system of governance we have of having two chambers and an executive branch that has to, make the call on something is that just because people are in the same political affiliation doesn't mean they're going to have the same ideas and plans on what direction the state should move and what's going to be in the best interest of it. And so we'll see what happens, over the course of time and the decisions that the legislature makes to ensure that our state budget can be sound and that we're doing the things that ensure we'll be taken care of in the future.
yeah. Speaking of checks and balances, though, House Bill 1236 was heard yesterday morning, I believe, and it was interesting to say the least. So this bill basically would allow it says that the state legislature, if they believe that the president has issued an executive order or taken some kind of federal action that the Oklahoma State House believes is unconstitutional, that they can, one, ask the attorney general to challenge it or take it to court, which is already the case. That's how it happens now. And then two, if the AG won't or doesn't, then the Oklahoma legislature could thereby rule and say
Vote.
take a vote, a majority vote, and say that is unconstitutional.
Or essentially, we don't like this bill and we don't like this executive order that the president has done. Therefore, Oklahoma's not going to abide by because a majority of Oklahoma lawmakers don't like it.
Right. So this came out of the States' Rights Committee, which we talked about a few weeks ago. I'm working on a sound effect for this. All I have so far is the sound of paper being torn, which I think is just the sound of our U.S. Constitution just being ripped in half. I'm going to add some kind of like oopsie or something to it, but it seems like this kind of legislation is just absurd. There was questions during the debate that someone said. I think Representative Brewer asked Representative McBride, who was presenting the bill, well, what happens if there's federal funding attached to this executive order, right? Like, let's say President Biden issues an executive order to give all Americans $600 as COVID relief payments or something. And that people would have money and you don't think it's constitutional, would you still challenge it? Like, what are you going to do then? And they were like, well, we'll look at each one and kind of see what we think. And it strikes me that they didn't have any problem, notably, with any of the executive orders that the previous administration issued, right? Which is plentiful. And the fact that, as I think Representative Virgin pointed out, we seem to only have a states' rights committee when there is a Democratic president. And so this, first of all, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I think we all know that this doesn't pass muster, right? Like, this has been established in the 10th Amendment. This is already a thing that, and that's their cover, right? They're saying that, well, the Constitution says that all powers that are not specifically given to the federal government are thereby given to the states. But there's also the supremacy clause in there that says, yeah, but the federal government law overrides the state laws. And now
Absolutely.
you can go through the courts, yes, but you can't just be like, we don't like your rule, we're not going to follow it.
Can
That
you
is,
imagine how much money we would spend over the next 4 years fighting any executive orders or policies at the federal level that the state didn't like, that then were just upheld because it is clearly within the power of the federal executive to do those things, right? Like that,
and
Oklahomans have to remember that there's our tax dollars pay every time our attorney general enters into any type of
mhm.
litigation.
Well, and the thing is, this bill doesn't really do anything, right? So, like, it basically says, should the attorney general decline to pursue action based on the determination of the legislature, then the legislature may declare the action unconstitutional by the majority vote. But that, and it says, notwithstanding any provision, then basically no one can implement any action that restricts a person's right, or that of the attorney general, to be unconstitutional. Listen, just because a majority of the state legislature should happen to say we believe this to be unconstitutional doesn't make it unconstitutional,
Right.
right? They
Right.
could declare that the sky is green. It doesn't make the sky green. And so,
Right.
at best, this is grandstanding. At worst, it's a waste of time and money. And I guess it really, at the worst, like, it erodes the public's faith in our elected officials and our government as a institution.
Absolutely. And I think a root of the legislature taking up some type of bill in this nature is related to the Standing Rock issue and the Keystone pipeline that was being put in place. Somehow the legislature is making connection that President Biden wants to stifle oil and gas and hurt oil and gas jobs in Oklahoma, even though there was a story in like a almost like an op-ed in the Journal Record where a oil exec was saying that actually it's kind of a good thing that this executive order is in place because that helps Oklahoma in these different ways, right? It's still the optics that like this thing therefore will hurt Oklahoma somehow, even if there isn't a legitimate connection to make A plus B, right? And then there's issues with the president restoring things that the previous president removed our
Right.
country from. So, like the Paris Climate Agreement
Right.
and bringing us back with the United Nations. I mean, and all those other kind of things that this president has done by executive order. They don't like those actions, but I don't understand what that means in terms of like this bill. So, what does it mean if Oklahoma says, I don't like the fact that you stopped the Keystone pipeline? Are we going to send Oklahoma dollars to Canada to get that going again? Or
Yeah. So I imagine, as we described earlier, this is one of those issues for members to campaign on next year to say, I passed a bill standing up to, socialist Joe Biden and his unconstitutional executive orders, even if they don't actually challenge any of them, right? or it allows them to actually pass a resolution saying we declare this measure to be unconstitutional, and Oklahomans don't have to follow it, which doesn't mean anything, right? Like it's not worth the paper it's printed on. So, but it'll be printed on some flyers and some mailers and walk cards when they're out there campaigning. All right. Well, Bailey, as we wind down, I'd like to end on redistricting, if that's okay. I think we've hit everything else on our agenda. So, listeners, you know that I also run another organization called People Not Politicians, and we've been working actively about trying to end partisan gerrymandering in Oklahoma. Of course, our ballot initiative got waylaid and ultimately defeated by COVID, if you will, last year. So the redistricting falls, as it has in the past, to the state legislature. They've been working on it. We've been working on it. And yesterday, both the House and the Senate redistricting committees had meetings and released some very important and helpful information. They told us the timeline for what they're going to be doing and what data source they're going to be doing, because the Census Bureau won't have redistricting data available until September. They said not before September, but they should have it by September 30th. So whether it's the 1st, the 15th, or the 29th, we don't know. But that's a long way off. And we have to have districts in place by October, November, because candidates have to live in their district for 6 months before they file for office. They will file for office in April, so you got to count backwards. So it's kind of there's like a deadline there. Now there's, some legal avenues. The courts could say everyone's grandfathered in or whatever, but people would like to know what district they live in so they can run for the appropriate district when they file. So the legislature announced that they will be using the 2015 to 2019 population estimates from the Census Bureau's American Communities Survey. They do those and they average them in 3-year and 5-year increments. That's a good data source. It's probably more accurate than the census itself, to be honest. So that's a good way to go about it. That data is already available. I think they only have 2015 through 2018 data, but it's out. Regardless, they've got most of it out there. And in fact, it is already loaded into websites like Dave's Redistricting, which is a free resource, a free website where you can go on and view and draw maps for redistricting. And in fact, the state legislature both the House and Senate are signing agreements with Dave's so that will be the website that we, the public, can submit maps for consideration. And so it's a good deal. So this coming Monday, which is just a few days away, they announced yesterday that Monday there's going to be a training, Monday night. So if you happen to listen to this between now and Monday, it'll be Monday at 6. There is a link on the Oklahoma House website, I'm pretty sure, on the redistricting page. I will try to share it out from People Not Politicians on Twitter and Facebook, and probably on Let's Fix This as well. I think this is an important thing. For one, because I watched Dave's did a training a couple of months ago about redistricting just for everybody who's interested, and I watched it on my iPad while I was whittling a spoon in the garage one day, and it was really great. It was super interesting. Their website's about as easy to use as you can make this kind of thing, so that's fascinating. The thing that is also worth noting, and I will end with this, is that while they will draw the House and Senate maps this spring using that ACS population estimate data, they will still have to they'll have to come back in the fall for a special session and to at least draw the congressional maps, and they may also need to tweak the state legislative maps. So that's a very important thing. So as with everything with this whole redistricting effort, it's drawn out even longer now. And that means we have to keep a very close eye for a lot longer. And then whenever they come back for special session, everybody gets a little bit nervous, right? So a special session call can be made by the legislature themselves or by the governor, but it has to be for a specific reason. And they can only pass legislation that is directly related to that reason or reasons. And so we will be paying attention, right? Because a lot can happen, as we know, in 6 months. And so at this time, we expect them to come back for probably, 5 days or a week, pass these maps, get them out there, and get on down the road. But there's always a chance something could go haywire. So that's where my brain will be. If you are listening to this and you're not already interested in redistricting and gerrymandering, you should be. Please go to peoplenotpoliticians.org and sign up.
Your representation matters.
It sure does. This is really like a true framework of how things are done issue. It's a big deal. All right. Bailey, anything else you got for us this week?
Well, one piece of good news is that thanks to the work of Cece and JB and Francie and Cherie and a whole lot of folks whose names we probably will never know, just many community activists and leaders and faith leaders and others, Julius Jones will have a commutation hearing in March. And so that's another example of the value of leveraging your voice, even when it feels difficult or impossible, because so many people have come together and have organized around giving him that opportunity to be heard, because there's questions about how the case was handled, and the folks advocating on his behalf believe that he was innocent. He's on death row, so he could be killed and executed by the state. And so this is a huge issue that happened this week thanks to the work of local organizers. And so there's power to the people when people use their power. So
that's exactly right. That's a good note to end on if there's ever been one. Thank you so much. Bailey, thanks for being here.
Of course. Thank you, Eddie.
Listeners, thanks for being here as well. Don't forget to take a look at our website. We've got a new kind of refresh going on there. Look under the resources tab. If you click on get involved, there's a bunch of stuff there, including updated lists with all of the House and Senate members, phone numbers, emails, office numbers, executive assistants, Facebook and Twitter if I've got it. Still got to add some more of those, but a really great resource, very handy. And again, don't forget to check out peoplenotpoliticians.org. All right, well, that's it. Decisions are made by those who show up. Have a good week, everybody.